So in this particular project, I have a great interest in juxtaposing survivor stories, juxtaposing in the sense of trying to get a handle on what survivors of atrocity recollect, remember, and wish to disseminate. What I'm particularly interested in is taking the richness of those particular stories and seeing how law interacts with them. I became particularly attracted to the topic when I reread some of the iconic work coming out of the Nazi concentration camps by survivors. Authors such as Primo Levi, Ka-Tzetnik, Imre Kertesz, Viktor Frankl. Their body of work, of recollection, and of remembrance is remarkably kaleidoscopic in its emotive depth, plays a cadence on a variety of registers, and fundamentally explores and examines aspects of life in the concentration camps that have not fully infused or informed judicial narratives. Primo Levi, for example, in some of his most powerful work, examines life in what he famously calls the gray zone. And in the gray zone, and in his famous book, Survival in Auschwitz, what Levi does is foreground the daily interactions among the prisoners. His subjects are not the SS, not the overseers of the camps, not the organizers, not the bureaucrats, not the torturers, and not the sadists. His subject matter are the prisoners, their relations among and between each other. For Levi, life in the camps is about the betrayals, the resistance, the compassion, the camaraderie, the support, and the injustices that the prisoners visit upon each other while living within the most squalid and invidious of circumstances, foisted and forced upon them by the Nazi apparatus. Levi goes to great length to document that survival in the camps was a matter of safeguarding your own possessions, your own meager rations, your own meager provisions. Levi goes on about he constantly faced the threat of theft from other prisoners. He reserves his greatest level of disdain for the Sonderkommando, the Kapos, the Prominents. Inmates who were conscripted into, coerced into, cajoled into, but yet at times volunteered and came forward to serve within the administrative apparatus of the camp. For Levi, it is an incomplete rendition and explication of life in the camps to not focus on the reality that victims may come to victimize others. And the ability of literature, history, and biography to deal with the ambiguity of victims as perpetrators and perpetrators as victims, to flesh out the circularity of the human condition under terrible moments. The ability of literature, history, and biography to do so reposes in the fact that these authors do not condemn or denounce. Viktor Frankl, for example, goes well out of his way to emphasize that although every individual has agency, that every individual can control how he or she may respond to even the most coercive of circumstances, decisions to exercise agency in a fashion that may tread upon or oppress others may be worthy of discussion in literary format, may be worthy as central elements of the politics of remembrance, but are not subject matter for condemnation or denunciation. And in fact, it is precisely because there is no obligation to condemn that the accounts of life in atrocious situations by these authors may be so rich and so vivified and so invigorated, both with pain and deception, but also with mercy, resistance, and hope. So the bottom line in this scenario is as follows. Can law accommodate the richness of these narratives? Can justiciability serve a positive form when it comes to victims who victimize? And to me, the central point of this research project is to recognize the salience of these stories to survivors and interrogate law's ability to move forward and actually absorb these rich narratives. There was an attempt in the 1950s in Israel to bring justiciability to these questions and to see the Kapos, namely the Jewish inmates who served as part of the camp structure, as defendants. In 1950, the Israeli Knesset passed the Nazi and Nazi collaborators law. This particular law was put in place so as to address the reality that survival in the Holocaust may not entirely have been the result of pure good fortune, good luck, courage, resistance, or strength, or valor, but that in some instances, survival may be traceable to complicity in the death and torture of others. Several trials were held that involved Kapos. These trials revealed the clumsiness and awkwardness of the criminal law in dealing with these kinds of questions of victim-perpetrators. In some instances, the judges used strong language to denounce the Kapo, but then issued a very mild sentence. In other cases, the judges simply recognized the futility or impossibility of squeezing within legal language, of accommodating within the courtroom and jailhouse the agency of those who in invidious circumstances chose to inflict and externalize suffering upon others. To me, this is instructive, for it suggests the definite limits of the law. So where do we go then from here? Stories of victim perpetration are salient to survivors and the public, and the law is very clumsy, awkward in dealing with it. And in fact, the law is clumsy and awkward in dealing with it, not by inadvertence, but entirely by intentionality. The criminal law reposes on categories of guilt or innocence, clarity, finality, certainty. Its binary division between the powerful and the powerless animate its very structure and fuel its capacity to deliver outrage and condemnation. Questions of victim perpetration are not only relevant historically, theoretically, or as a matter of thinking about what role law may or may not occupy. They're relevant in the here and now in the practice of international criminal justice institutions. In January of 2016, the International Criminal Court will be called upon to confirm charges against Dominic Ongwen. Dominic Ongwen, a brigadier commander of the Lord's Resistance Army in northern Uganda, entered the custody of the International Criminal Court in January of this year. Ongwen has been charged with 67 counts of war crimes and crimes against humanity. Ongwen, however, emerges from a path where his initial entry point into the LRA was that of victim. Kidnapped on his way home from school at the age of 14, Dominic Ongwen was abducted and brutalized into the Lord's Resistance Army. Within that context, however, he rose within the ranks. Unlike Kapos, unlike the Sonderkommando and the Prominenz, Ongwen killed not only to survive, but at instances to thrive, and ultimately rose to senior leadership levels in which he created the very oppressive conditions in which he had previously served. Yet, it is undeniable that an adolescent at the age of 14, socialized into the Lord's resistance army, is being socialized into a context in which it becomes increasingly difficult to speak of agency and free will, to speak of an ability to control one's environment. Hence, in many ways, the Ongwen trial will expose the victim-perpetrator circularity that so infuses the writing emerging from the Holocaust and so infuses many on-the-ground accounts in Uganda itself as to how former officials, members, and soldiers within the Lord's Resistance Army should be successfully and durably reintegrated following demobilization. Ongwen is the youngest defendant at the International Criminal Court. He is also the only defendant at that court to actually face criminal charges for conduct that he himself endured, in particular, unlawful recruitment of children as soldiers and enslavement as a crime against humanity. Will it be possible for the judicial proceedings that implicate Ongwen to do more than simply determine in a crude binary fashion his guilt or innocence? Can these proceedings in any way explicate the complexities of child soldiering, the circularity of victims blending into perpetrators, the reality of the malleability of power within armed groups and armed organizations? On the one hand, the Kapo's trials suggest that this will be a difficult and problematic course to follow. On the other hand, perhaps it may be that the penal framework provides these kinds of apertures. Perhaps there is an ability to achieve and actuate expressive goals, didactic goals, of teaching an audience of what life was like in the LRA for someone who entered as a child victim. But am I optimistic? Not particularly. The game of the trial is that of adversarialism. The game of the trial is that of defense presenting Ongwen's vulnerabilities and the prosecution speaking over those defense presentations in order to emphasize the heinousness of his conduct committed after he had hit the age of 18, the point at which the International Criminal Court achieves and assumes jurisdiction. Still, perhaps then a broader lesson emerges. If the law is hampered and handicapped in its ability to actuate and explicate the needs for survivors in many instances to fully explain the ambiguousness of the human condition in times of atrocity, if the law is unable to do so, if the simplistic nature of its vocabulary cannot articulate the resonance of these complexities, then there are two paths forward. The first path is for the law to try to do better. The second path is for the law to stay away. Law will never stay away in the sense that the outrageous and painful conduct that involves atrocity cries out for condemnation that can best be actuated and achieved through the law. But perhaps what the law can do is step back and try less to assert itself as the iconic and best way in which to authenticate atrocity, deliver a historical record, and promote justice. Perhaps the law can play its role, but in playing the role that it does, become hesitant to squeeze out the kinds of narratives that other disciplines may provide, that other methods of documentation may yield, and that other vocabularies may be able to explain. And fundamentally, what I hope to come out of this project is a level of self-awareness among international lawyers that law may be a path to justice, but not the path to justice. And in many instances, justice hangs in the air of literature and biography, of history and film, and that it is not only the courtroom that may achieve the most compelling description of how, why, and under what conditions and by whom atrocity actually occurs. When Primo Levi discusses that life in the lager is not only one of camaraderie among the oppressed, but of violence among the oppressed, this story is not translatable into the language of law, but it is a crucially important story. Another angle that I think is of great possibility would be for international lawyers to recognize that alternate methods of justice may still serve to denounce, but may do so in ways that are more compatible with the nuance and granularity of survivors' stories. Truth commissions, traditional reintegration ceremonies, modalities of justice that involve social reintegration, ceremony, and ritual may be much more at ease with that which law expresses great unease, namely the fact that in times of crisis, people slip from one position to another and may exhibit great mercy in one instance and great cruelty in others. So instead of searching for this clarity and finality through the trial, perhaps we should have fewer trials and open more space to alternate justice mechanisms.